He was already dead before anyone knew his name. That is how they wanted it. A name is a record, and records are dangerous when the wrong people start reading them, so they buried him without one. Just another body in the Louisiana soil, just another example made public on a December morning. To remind the assembled crowd what happened to those who refused their place in the order of things. What they could not bury was what he had done. What he had done was this for 6 months, in 1841. A single man, living openly on a Louisiana sugar plantation, sleeping in their cabins, eating their food, working their fields, standing in their lineups during morning assembly, had systematically dismantled the most feared slave hunting operation in the region. He had ambushed armed men on patrol. He had burned their headquarters to the ground. He had taken their weapons and left them tied to trees in the swamp with messages carved into the bark beside them. He had turned professional trackers into men who refused to work within 20 miles of the plantation. He had made hunters afraid of the dark. His name in the official records was Joseph. A single word, no surname, no origin, no history before his purchase price, and the date he appeared on an inventory ledger. His real name was Kwame, and he had been trained since boyhood for exactly this. Louisiana, in 1841, was a place where wealth grew from suffering in precise and documented quantities. The sugar estates, stretching along the Mississippi River, were among the most profitable agricultural operations in North America, and among the most brutal. The mortality rate for enslaved workers on sugar plantations was so high that planters budgeted for replacement as a standard operating cost. A man could arrive healthy in the spring and be dead by the following winter, and this was considered not tragedy but arithmetic. Kwame had arrived from the Gold Coast of West Africa in 1836. One of 200 people packed into the lower hold of a ship that had not been designed to carry human cargo, and had been converted to do so anyway. 43 people died during the crossing. Kwame was not among them, not because fortune favored him, but because he had decided somewhere, in the darkness of that hold, that he would not give them the satisfaction. He was purchased by a man named Elias Drummond, who owned 1,100 acres of cane fields upriver from New Orleans, and who had a regional reputation for breaking men who arrived too proud. Drummond never broke Kwame. He just never knew he hadn't. The first thing Kwame understood about Drummond's plantation was that it operated on the assumption of total knowledge. Drummond believed he knew everything that happened within his borders. He had overseers who reported to him daily, a network of informants among the enslaved workers who received small privileges in exchange for information, and a group of 6 professional hunters who lived in a fortified cabin at the edge of the property, and whose sole function was the pursuit in return of anyone who attempted to escape. Their leader was a man named Cutter Hayes, 41 years old, a former militia tracker who had spent 2 decades refining the business of hunting human beings into something he conducted with professional pride. Hayes claimed to have returned more than 200 runaways in his career. He kept a log. Drummond's system had one flaw. It was built entirely on the assumption that the people inside it were too broken to think clearly. Kwame was not broken. He had spent 4 years constructing a mask of perfect compliance, working beyond what was required, never speaking unless spoken to, keeping his eyes down in the presence of overseers, appearing at all times to be exactly the man Drummond needed him to be. Behind that mask, he was running a different kind of operation entirely. He mapped the plantation with the precision of a military surveyor. He memorized the patrol schedules of the overseers and the hunters. Not just the standard routes, but the variations, the shortcuts, the habits that men develop when they have done the same job for years and stopped being careful. He identified the storage locations for weapons, tools, and supplies. He cataloged the personalities of every person in authority over him, noting which men were cautious and which were overconfident, which were genuinely dangerous, and which were merely cruel. He studied the swamps and forests surrounding the property with particular attention. He learned which trails narrowed and which opened out, where the ground was firm and where it gave way to soft mud that would slow a horse to a walk, where the cypress trees grew thick enough to hide a man completely, even in daylight. He ate plants others ignored, learning from an old man on the plantation which roots were edible and which would kill you. He was preparing for something he did not yet know exactly what. The answer arrived on a Tuesday morning in April 1841, when his closest companion, a man named Daniel, who had helped him survive his first brutal months on The plantation was loaded into a wagon and sold to a cotton operation in Alabama as punishment for a minor infraction. Kwame stood in the field and watched the wagon roll down the road until it disappeared. He stood there for a long time after it was gone. That evening, he made his decision. He would not run. Running was what they expected. Running was something they had built an entire system to defeat. He would do something the system had no plan for. He would fight, and he would fight in the only way that could work, not openly where numbers and weapons overwhelmed everything, but in the dark where knowledge mattered more than firepower and patience mattered more than strength. He chose the site 3 weeks before he used it. The trail from the plantation to the swamp's edge narrowed at one point between two massive live oak trees whose roots had lifted the ground on both sides into natural barriers. A man on horseback had to pass through this gap, single file. The overhanging moss reduced visibility to almost nothing even in daylight. At night, with only the small circle of light from a carried lantern, a rider coming through could see perhaps 6 feet ahead. Kwame had been watching the Thursday night patrol for 4 months, Hayes and 2 men. Same route, same timing, same casual confidence of people who had made a journey so many times they had forgotten to be afraid of it. On the night of June 12, 1841, Kwame slipped out of his cabin, after the plantation had gone quiet, moved to the equipment shed, through a gap in the boards he had identified months earlier, and retrieved a heavy axe, a length of rope, and a cane blade he had been sharpening in secret for 6 weeks. He was at the oak trees 2 hours before the patrol was due. He strung the rope across the trail, at the precise height of a rider's throat, tight enough to catch loose enough not to be seen by lamplight, until it was too late, and concealed himself in the undergrowth, on the south side. Then he waited. Warriors learned patience, before anything else. His father had taught him this. To breathe in the rhythm of the forest, to become still enough that the nighttime sounds returned around you, as if you were not there. Around midnight, he heard hoofbeats. 3 riders, Hayes in front, with the lantern, the other 2 close behind, rifles slung across their backs. They were talking. One of them laughed. Hayes's horse entered the gap between the oaks. Kwame pulled the rope taut. The line caught Hayes across the throat with tremendous force and stripped him backward off his horse. The lantern flew from his hand and shattered. On the ground, darkness closed over the trail like a hand. The 2 men behind had less than 2 seconds to react. Their horses reared before either could reach his rifle. Kwame was already moving out of the undergrowth, axe swinging, striking the nearest rider hard enough to knock him from his horse, turning and catching the second man's arm as he raised his weapon, pulling him down. The whole thing was over in 30 seconds. 3 armed professional hunters lay on the ground. Their horses had bolted into the darkness. Kwame stood over them in the silence of the forest, breathing steadily, and made his first calculated decision. He would not kill them. Not out of mercy, out of strategy. A dead man delivers no message. A man who returns to the plantation stripped of his weapons, his boots, and his dignity, bound in the darkness. Like an animal delivers something that travels for hundreds of miles. He tied them with a rope that had taken Hayes off his horse, stripped them of everything useful, and walked back to the plantation in the dark. He was in his cabin before dawn. When he stood in the assembly line the following morning, wearing the same confused and frightened expression as every other enslaved person on the plantation, while Drummond raged about the attack, no one looked at him twice. By August, the hunters had a name for him. They called him the Shadow, though not loudly, and not in company. It was a private word, the kind that men use when they need to name a fear without admitting they are afraid. In the quarters of Drummond's plantation, the enslaved workers used a different word, one that translated approximately as the one who learned their language and spoke it back to them. Between June and August of 1841, Kwame conducted 11 separate operations against the slave hunting apparatus of Drummond's estate and the surrounding region. On June 24th, 12 days after the first ambush, while Hayes and 4 other hunters were on extended patrol, Kwame approached the hunter's cabin from the rear, the only side not visible from the main house, and set fire to it. He waited in the shadows until the one remaining hunter stumbled out coughing, struck him once with a heavy branch, dragged him into the forest, and left him tied to a tree with a message carved into the bark: "The hunted are learning to hunt." By the time Hayes and his men returned, the cabin was ash, and their colleague was being found by a morning patrol, conscious, weaponless, and unable to explain what had happened to him in a way that didn't make the situation worse. On July 8th, two hunters tracking an unrelated runaway through the swamp were themselves ambushed. One was injured, the other escaped only by abandoning all his equipment and running in blind panic through knee-deep water for half a mile. On July 22nd, a patrol horse was found dead in the field, killed by a single clean shot through the heart. The rifle that fired it had been taken from one of the earlier ambushes. The message was unmistakable. The attacks were connected. The attacker was armed with their own weapons, and he had been patient enough to hold that rifle for 6 weeks before using it on a specific target for a specific purpose. By August, the psychological damage had outpaced the physical. Slave hunters across the region began declining assignments near Drummond's plantation. Some demanded double rates, some quit the profession entirely. The economics of the system were shifting. The cost of maintaining control was rising while the reliability of enforcement was collapsing. Drummond held emergency meetings with neighboring planters. Theories circulated about maroon groups, about northern agitators, about organized resistance networks. No one suggested the obvious explanation, that one man sleeping in their own cabins and working their own fields was responsible, because that explanation was too destabilizing to entertain. The entire system rested on the belief that the people inside it had been rendered powerless. One man, conducting a 6-month guerrilla campaign while living openly among his pursuers, did not fit inside that belief. So they looked outward and found nothing. And Kwame stood in the morning lineups and kept his eyes appropriately downcast. The end came through betrayal, as it often did. A man named Ezra, desperate for small improvements in his own conditions, went to Drummond in late November with observations he had been collecting for weeks, that Kwame sometimes disappeared from his cabin at night, that he seemed less frightened than others when the stories of the attacks were told, that he had once been seen near the toolshed after dark. None of it was proof. Kwame had been scrupulously careful. There was nothing in his cabin, nothing in his possessions, nothing in his behavior during daylight hours that could be connected to a single one of the attacks when Drummond had him pulled from the field and questioned. Kwame denied everything with the calm steadiness of a man who had been preparing for this possibility from the beginning. Drummond had him imprisoned anyway. The attacks stopped immediately. The coincidence was not missed. Without a confession, without physical evidence, Drummond understood he had no legal case, but he had also understood for months that the law was not the point. The point was restoration of control. On December 14, 1841, he ordered a gallows erected in the center of the plantation and had every enslaved worker assembled to watch. Kwame stood on the platform with a rope around his neck and looked across the assembled faces of people he had lived among for 5 years. He saw old men who had been on this plantation before he arrived. He saw children who had been born into it. He saw the faces of people who had spent their entire lives being told that what had happened over the previous 6 months was impossible, that one person armed with nothing but knowledge and patience and the willingness to act could not hold an entire system of professional violence at bay. He had proved that it was possible. When Drummond demanded a final confession, Kwame spoke in a clear voice that carried across the assembled silence. He said that a man fights for his people, even when the outcome is already decided. He said that what had been learned could not be unlearned, and that the knowledge of what was possible could not be put back inside the silence it had come from. Then the platform dropped. The crowd stood without speaking. No one moved. They were there because they were required to be watching, because they had been required to watch. But something in the quality of that silence was different from every silence that had preceded it. Something had shifted that Drummond's gallows could not shift back. Within 3 months, 2 of the overseers on the plantation had requested transfers to other estates. Barnes, who had led the swamp patrol on September 12th, when 3 of his men were shot and the rest fled in disorder, never returned to slave hunting. His log, in which he had recorded more than 200 captures over 2 decades, ended with a blank page where his final entry should have been. The attacks stopped with Kwame's death, but the stories didn't stop. They traveled through the invisible networks that connected plantations across hundreds of miles, through the careful whispers passed during Sunday assemblies, through the encrypted languages that people develop when the only thing they own is information. The story of the man who had made the hunters afraid of their own swamps moved through Louisiana and beyond, growing with each telling, becoming larger than any one man's life. History buried his name. History did not bury what he proved. A man can live inside a system designed to destroy him, and still with patience and knowledge and the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment, make that system afraid of the dark. The platform dropped on December 14, 1841. The knowledge it was meant to silence had already traveled too far to catch.